Catchy little tune, isn't that? Hey everybody, welcome to class. I'm Frank Markow. I'm your professor for this class in executive ministry. And today we're going to be talking about all things legal, right? We're going to be talking about the legal issues that church leaders, pastors deal with on a regular basis. Now, again, some of you might be thinking, whoa, we're under grace, we're not under the law, right? Well, as citizens of this great country, you are under the law. And so maybe it's not the law, the Old Testament law. You're saved by grace, but there are laws that are applicable to church leaders and churches. And so as a leader in the church, you need to understand what these laws are. Now, again, this is a vast topic and we can only cover so much, but I'm going to try to hit the highlights here just so you have a basic working knowledge of some of the legal issues involved in operating a church. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some ethical issues and the difference between the law and ethics. They're closely related, but they're very distinct and separate topics from one another. So hang on as we get into all things church law. Now, churches must comply with local, state, and federal laws related to things like employment, property, finances, etc. Right? So we have as Christians, Jesus said, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's," right? And so part of our obligations as Christians is to obey the applicable laws in all of these areas here. Now, but beyond the legal obligation, we have ethical responsibilities, right? Church leaders are held to a high standard and a higher standard of ethical, legal behavior, right? And ethical behavior. So this is important. You have to understand the importance of the legal and ethical issues because, think about this, if mishandled, these can damage a church's reputation and witness in a community. Now, right, sadly, we live in a day and age where it seems like every other month we see some sort of ethical lapse by a church leader or some wrongdoing or mishandling of finances and all those sorts of things. And every time that happens, you can just imagine the devil going, "Hooray, yeah, we fired off another shot, we got another one down." Well, we don't want that, right? We don't want to contribute to that. And so as church leaders, you need to understand what these things are because there's an old saying, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So you might be saying, well, I didn't know those things. I didn't know I thought my only job as a pastor was to show up and preach and love people, right? Isn't that what God's called me to do? Yeah, but if you're going to run a church, you also need to understand the legal issues involved in running a church. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer, but you need to understand some of these basic issues here. Now, what is the difference between what is legal and what is ethical? Law versus ethics. Well, let's read here. Legality. Legal actions are those that conform to the laws established by governing authorities, such as local, state, or federal laws. What is legal is determined by the written law of the society, which can be enforced by the courts, the police, or other governmental agencies. Legal standards are usually based on rules that have been codified in statutes or regulations and are typically enforceable with penalties. Ethics involve moral principles that govern an individual or group's behavior. Ethical decisions are often based on personal values, cultural norms, religious beliefs, or professional standards. Unlike legal standards, which are set by governments and are mandatory, ethical standards are often more subjective and not necessarily enforceable by law. They guide people to act with integrity, fairness, and in the best interest of others beyond merely following the law. Okay, so it's important to understand that laws have ethical basis, but ethics can transcend the law. In fact, these two can be in tension at times. So, for example, something might be legal, but not ethical. An action can be, for instance, in some places, a company may legally avoid paying taxes through loopholes, but this may be considered unethical because it undermines the social contract and community welfare. Now, if the law says I don't have to pay a certain tax, I'm not going to pay a tax, right? So some people consider that unethical, though, to actually use the law. Now, something might be ethical but not legal. Conversely, For example, in certain oppressive regimes, providing aid to marginal groups may be against the law, but is considered ethical from a humanitarian perspective. Or kind of the classic example, think about people like Anne Frank and others during World War II who were hiding the Jewish people who were under persecution from the Nazi regime, right? That was illegal, but it was the right thing to do. It was the ethical thing to do. Now, in today's climate, you might say, well, blocking the doors of an abortion clinic, right? That's breaking the law, but people that are pro-life and really believe in that will do that in order to, stop it from happening and to raise attention for the pro-life position. Now, let's get back to legal issues proper here. Now, there's 4 areas here that we'll talk about. We'll talk about in brief today, which are employment law and understanding things like equal opportunity, non-discrimination, and workplace policies is important for church leaders. Tax-exempt status, compliance with the IRS rules to maintain the tax-exempt status. Child protection policies, legal requirements for background checks and safeguarding, and property use and zoning, legalities around using church property and facilities. And again, all of these are pretty vast areas. We can't cover it in one lecture like this. I encourage you to find some resources out there to help you. And I've listed one here. It's www.churchlawandtax.com. And this is a great resource. I use this source to help me prepare for this lecture right here. But I encourage you to go on to that website, mark that website, and if you have questions about things, chances are there's a good answer for you on that website as well. So resource yourself. Become familiar with the kinds of resources that you need in order to answer these legal questions that you might have leading your church. All right, so let's talk about the first one here, employment law in the church. Now, the first thing we can say that's different about the church law is that there's special considerations that apply to religious organizations. And in a sense, we can discriminate based on religion, all right? So if you're a Christian and you don't have to hire somebody who's not a professing Christian, or somebody's a Buddhist, you don't have to hire them, right? So we can discriminate based upon some of those deeply held foundational issues to us. But you still must avoid discriminating in hiring and firing employment practices based on some of these other things, right? So protected classes, so gender, race, nationality, those sorts of things, right? So we're still incumbent to be non-discriminatory in our hiring, except in that one area, right? So people need to share our faith values. Now, one of the big issues that's come up in the recent past is hiring homosexuals. And my understanding is that a church does not have to. If that's against their morals and against their stance, they believe it violates their own integrity and understanding of Scripture, they don't have to hire somebody who is a professing homosexual. Volunteers versus employees. Know the legal distinction, as volunteers are generally not covered by the same laws as employees, but churches must still provide a safe working environment, right? So again, there's really no law on volunteering, but the same sorts of things should apply in how you hire, fire, discrimination, those sorts of things. Now, let's turn the page here a little bit and talk about the tax-exempt status and financial compliance, right? Now, most of you probably know that churches can become exempt from they're exempt for tax purposes, and they have a special designation as a legal entity. Now, we still have to comply with the IRS regulations, and there's a form, I believe it's the 990 that a church has to file every year, and we have to ensure that our financial records are in order, especially regarding charitable donations, right? So we talked about church finances and fund accounting and all those sorts of things, right? So it's important that we track those things. Now, you might be part of a denomination, and as an individual local church, you don't have to file you don't have to file for a nonprofit status, right? Nor do you have to fill out that form every year. So usually the denomination has those sorts of things. Different denominations run this differently. So you need to be sure whether your church is covered under the denomination's exemption and tax filing, right? So usually if you're an independent church, though, you have to do these things yourself. You have to file for the nonprofit status, and you have to do that tax return every year. Now, it's important that you maintain your tax exempt status. There's a couple things that will get you in trouble, hot water, real quick. And the first of all is engaging in political campaigns or lobbying, right? Now, again, this is kind of a slippery slope. If you invite a senator, or a local politician to to preach that morning, that could be considered, engaging in political campaigning, especially if they're, promoting their campaign. Now, one of the things that churches do around, political season, election season, is they'll have voters' guides. And the voter guide will tell you what politicians are in favor of what policies and what politicians are in favor of other policies. And those are perfectly fine, right? That's not engaging in political campaigning or lobbying, right? So you can provide information to people to let them know what is okay for them to do. Now, sometimes, there's this whole separation of church and state thing, and some people misinterpret that to mean that church folks don't have any right to speak up in politics. Well, that's pshaw. It really is. And so churches you have all the rights of any other citizen, but you just have to make sure that as a church, you're not overtly engaging in political campaigning. And then the other thing here is annual reporting requirements. I already mentioned the Form 990, but make sure you do that every year. If you don't do that, you can lose your tax exempt status. And, we talked about this last time, the importance of proper record keeping. Accurate financial records are essential for legal compliance and maintaining trust within the church community, all right? Now, the next issue here is child protection and safeguarding. Boy, and this is a sad story, right? Even in this day and age, sadly, in this day and age, there's been a lot of mishandling on this one. And so churches have to be very, very diligent to do all they can to safeguard and protect children. Now, I believe this isn't just a legal thing. This is an ethical and moral thing. This is our obligation to the Lord and to the body of Christ to make sure that our kids are safe. Because unfortunately, predators will try to use a local church to find kids that they can go after. And so churches have to be extra diligent to protect themselves. Now, this doesn't mean you need to be paranoid and everybody that signs up for, to be a Sunday school teacher is some sort of predator. I'm not trying to say that. But we have to do all we can to protect our kids, right? I'll just leave it at that. So every church must have clear policies in place to protect minors, including mandatory background checks for all staff and volunteers working with children. Okay, so if they're a staff person or volunteer, they have to have a background check. There's just no question about that anymore. And depending on local laws, churches may also be required to report suspected abuse or follow other safeguarding protocols, right? Now, one of the things I know churches started doing back in the 90s is making sure that there's a lot of windows into the classrooms, right? So I remember when I was a church staff in the 90s, we had all these doors on the Sunday room school, and we had to put these big, glasses in there so you can see. Well, now that's kind of like commonplace, right? So making sure that the kids are not alone with adults, right? You have the appropriate gender escorting children to the bathroom, and those sorts of things. And oftentimes, church leaders now they'll work in pairs, right? So there'll be two leaders there because that way one person can't get away with any funny business with the kiddos. And then, of course, training, providing ongoing training for staff and volunteers on child protection and reporting procedures. All right, so do lots of training for your folks, help them to understand these laws, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and that'll go a long way in helping keep your kids safe. And then another issue here is intellectual property in ministry. One of these is copyright issues, right? So all the songs you sing, right? Those are copywritten songs. And so churches have to be careful with using these materials, music, videos, and other media, right? So, for example, you can't have a church event and then show like, a Disney movie or something like that. I know we used to do that all the time back in the day, but now you can get in trouble if you show some kind of copywritten movie. Now, a lot of churches, a lot of parachurch organizations that they develop materials specifically for churches, and you can show them. But, Disney and Pixar and, all these movie producers, they're not necessarily producing these things to show for free. So you can get in trouble if you show things that are copywritten. And the same thing with songs, right? Now, one of the things that churches have, you might know about this, is for song copyright is called CCLI, right? And if you subscribe to CCLI, basically what you do is you can, sing the songs, and you can show the music on the overheads, but you have to report on that, and you have to show you have to keep track of all the songs that you did. And there's different levels of licenses. Obviously, bigger churches have to pay more, smaller churches have to pay less, but you keep track of it, and that's sort of the clearance for you to use copywritten songs. Okay, so if you're playing music every week and you're showing the lyrics up there, make sure that you are protected by using something like CCLI. To my knowledge, that's the biggest one out there that will help you do that. So, secure proper licenses for music and other content. Ensure that sermons, publications, and creative content are protected. So you also want to protect your own stuff, right? So let's just say you're an author or you're a pastor, and you create some materials, or you write a book, or those kinds of things. Make sure you get those things copywritten to protect yourself for your intellectual property. The next issue is property use and zoning. Now, churches must comply with local zoning laws when using their property for services, events, or other functions. And you can actually be liable, right? You want to ensure that the church is protected with proper insurance in case of accidents or property damage, right? So imagine you host an event in your church and you invite the community to come for some kind of, Halloween, trunk or treat or something like that. And you don't have insurance, and somebody hurts themselves on the property. Let's just say a little kid falls or something like that, something real bad happens to them. You need to have insurance for that, right? So you're not immune from the sorts of things that organizations need to do to protect themselves. And so you want to be in legal compliance, regularly review property use and policies to ensure the church is compliant with local ordinances and zoning laws. And two, this has to do with things like parking, right? How many people can park in certain areas, right? You have proper handicap parking, right? There's a certain amount you have to have depending on the size of your lot. So there's a lot of different things like that, what you can build on your property. So sometimes you think, well, we're a church, we're just going to put another building in the back there for our youth, or bring in a trailer, for Sunday schools. A lot of schools will do that, right? They kind of run out of room, and so they kind of put a little building or trailer thing in the back. You got to make sure you get permission and permits and all those sorts of things to comply with local building codes and zoning laws for that kind of stuff. Let's talk a little bit more about this one here. Okay, so zoning regulations. Zoning laws dictate how land can be used and are established by local governments. Churches may need permits to operate in residential or commercial zones. Conditional use permits may be required with specific conditions on parking, noise, and community impact. All right, so this is a big one, right? Especially if you're a growing church, a lot of people are going to be driving in. They're going to be, once your lot gets filled up, they're going to start parking down the street and those sorts of things. So you want to make sure that you're respecting the neighbors, their property, especially things like noise, like if you have an outdoor event and you're blaring the PA, then the neighbors start complaining. So to me, this is kind of like being a good neighbor. A church needs to be a good neighbor to its neighborhood. And again, we kind of do things, well, the Lord told us to have this ceremony or whatever. That's great, but you want to be a good leader. The Lord's not telling you to be a nuisance to your neighbors, I do not believe. Now, there's an interesting act that came out a while ago, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or RLUIPA. How would you say that? RLUIPA? Don't even try to say it, just spell it out. And this is a great law. This is actually beneficial for churches. It protects churches from discriminatory zoning laws and prevents substantial burdens on religious exercise, ensures equal treatment of religious and non-religious institutions. Now, back in the day, I was on a church staff, and the church got really big, and they needed to move. And it happened to be not too far away from a kind of a light industrial, commercial area. And so the thought was they were going to buy one of those light industrial kind of buildings, and because it was big, right? And they could retrofit it and kind of turn it into a church. Well, the city council said no. They said they couldn't do that. Well, they got the law involved, and it turns out the city could not say no to that. And part of the reason too is because when a church moves into a property like that, all of a sudden they can't collect property tax on it, right? So if you're the city manager, you're thinking, well, if I get a bunch of churches over there, I'm going to lose my tax base. I could get a tax-paying customer or a tax-paying resident in that building there. So that's part of the challenge too, right? Is they kind of see their tax revenues go. So you can't be discriminated against. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some legal maneuvering, but my understanding is that this act here protects you from being discriminated against in those sorts of things. Now, another issue is building codes and safety. Churches must comply with local building codes and safety regulations. So things like structural, electrical, fire safety, ADA compliance, and this is a big one, right? I remember when ADA first came out, everybody had to have an elevator. Oh man, well, how's that going to kill your church if you just have a small church? Now, if you're a bigger church and you can afford it, but this is something you have to make sure that you're in compliance with. So the ramps and the lighting, is there a way for handicapped folks to get in and out of the baptismal, right? So there's all these kind of little interesting things that you want to think about. And some of these fire safety things, you want to make sure you have the right amount of fire extinguishers around. Make sure things are well lit, that there's not tripping hazards. You get your inspection. So if you get a job done, you want to make sure you get it checked off and inspected. Now, a lot of small churches, at least from my experience, they're kind of mom and pop in the way they do things. And, Brother Bill, he's an electrician. He's going to come on over and he's going to fix the panel out there, and he's not going to charge anything for it. Well, guess what? Brother Bill lost his contractor's license 10 years ago, and he didn't bother to get a city inspector to come out and check out on it because, well, he's Bill. He knows what he's doing, right? That's wrong. That's totally wrong. You need to, get somebody who's licensed to do it and make sure you get the proper city inspections to sign off on it. Because God forbid something happens, right? Let's just say Brother Bill puts in that electrical panel and he does a shoddy job and the church goes up in flames, right? All right, see, then you're really in trouble because now you're liable because you didn't have proper inspection, proper work done in your building there. Other things too, occupancy limits based on the building size and design, right? So you want to make sure if the fire inspector walked into your service, he would not freak out because you've got 300 chairs crammed in a building that's designed for 200 people, right? So you ever seen a church that's so packed, it's like, people are, sitting on the aisles and those kinds of things. And in honesty, that can be a fire hazard. So you want to be aware of that. You don't want to create a situation that could be dangerous. Let's just say, God forbid, something does catch on fire and everybody's got to exit, right? So you need to have your exit signs well lit and right. You have to have enough exits for the size of the building. That stuff is all regulated, all building codes. They talk about how many exits you need to have and such. Especially in a crowded building like that, right, where panic can set out and people need to flee. So you want to make sure to observe those occupancy limits, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what about non-religious use of facilities? Well, churches may host events like weddings and meetings or community service, but they may face additional zoning regulations for non-religious use, and there could be possible tax implications if the property is used for commercial purposes. So let's just say, let's just say you rent out your parking lot, to a local storage place, and then you've got this huge piece of property, a huge lot, and you've got some extra land back there, and they say, hey, we'd like to build a little storage facility out there for the local community. We will pay you, $5,000 a month to do that. And you're like, yeah, we could use that. Well, that's what's considered auxiliary income. That is not contributions or tithes or offerings. Anything that's done for commercial purposes like that, that puts you in a different position there, and so you have to report that as income. That could actually be taxable income. Another thing too, a lot of stores have they have bookstores and those sorts of things. So my understanding is all the sales on books and paraphernalia that you sell in the bookstores, the oils and the rings and the T-shirt, the merch, you know what I mean? You have to collect and report sales tax on those sorts of things. But you don't have to pay income tax on those sorts of things. I think when it gets bigger, and now it's kind of you're rezoning, you're repurposing what it is that you do, that you have to start paying taxes on that. Parking and traffic issues. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Churches must comply with parking and traffic regulations. Zoning ordinances may require specific parking ratios based on the occupancy and consideration of traffic flows during large events. All right, so again, this is that be a good neighbor idea, right? If you've got a big event, a lot of people are going to come. You want to make sure that you get the cones out there, get your parking lot team out there to help direct traffic. Here in Texas, big churches often have the police out there right before services start and when they end, or special events, and they help direct the traffic. Now, I'm not exactly sure how you go to the police and get that kind of service, but it's possible. At least I know it is here in Texas. Tax-exempt status. Churches generally qualify for tax-exempt status, as I mentioned before, but property used for non-religious or commercial activities may become taxable, and so churches need to ensure property use aligns with tax-exempt requirements. And, again, be considerate of your neighbor and the impact that you have on the community. Consider your impact on the surrounding community, noise and traffic from events, and engaging with the community can help maintain positive relationships. All right, so you want to become, again, if you're a church, especially if you're really close to residential, and some churches are, you want to become good neighbors. You want to become good friends with the people. You want to make sure they're saved and they go to your church, so that way if you have an event or there's an issue, they're not going to call the cops. No, in all seriousness, do what you can to have good relationships with your neighbors, and I think that goes a long way towards some of those things. Well, that's it. Whirlwind tour of all things church, tax law, church law and compliance and those sorts of things. Again, I just kind of scratched the surface. Really use things like that website I mentioned earlier and other resources to help you navigate some of these concerns. But these are important, that we do the right thing, and we're not a nuisance to our neighbors. We're a blessing to our neighbors, right? We want to be a blessing to our neighbors. Anyhow, that's it for today. God bless you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.